All right, I want to welcome you to this week's LaRouche PAC Saturday night class. I'm Susan Kokinda, and tonight Bob Ingram is going to continue his discussion of the extraordinary role that George Washington played in the formation of this nation. We've called this series Rediscovering the Soul of America. We've done a number of different discussions addressing really unknown elements of the political, cultural, and philosophical foundations of our nation. And this is really urgently needed because if you look at a couple of the critical events that have taken place over the course of this last week, we have a lunatic president of the United States who's blithely talking about nuclear war, as if it's something you can recover by popping aspirin, since he's apparently had the Department of Health and Human Services order a couple of 100 million anti-radiation pills. We have a vice president of the United States who stood there in front of a bunch of South Korean leaders and talked about our strong relationship with the Republic of North Korea. And when you look at beyond this kind of obvious detachment from reality, but you look at the actual implications of the policies of this Biden administration and the people who run it, gambling with nuclear war, carrying out a sledgehammer to what is left of our productive economy, carrying out policies which have unleashed some of the worst inflation we've recently seen, but in an effort to somehow staunch that, is going to destroy what is left of our productive economy and leave us in circumstances of ever-increasing shortages and probably very soon a seized-up economy that doesn't function at all. There's really two ways you can respond to it. You can react to it, which is perfectly understandable, and we certainly hope a lot of that reaction takes the form of voting as many Democrats out of office as possible come November. But that in and of itself is really not sufficient, because really the only proper response to where we are today is to ask yourself the question, how did we get there? How did we get here? How did the greatest nation on earth get to the point of a so-called leadership occupying Washington, D.C. at this point, which is carrying out such absolutely criminal and very possibly deadly policies? And I think the theme of this class series, Rediscovering the Soul of America, begins to answer that question of how did we get there? Because I think far too many patriots really have the appropriate and necessary understanding of what the philosophical, economic, cultural, and scientific policies were that were wielded by people like George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, that created our republic. So while on the one hand, we see a growing rejection of policies which are clearly anti-American and one could argue anti-human, the deeper understanding of what American policies actually are has been too lacking in too many people. So I want to turn it immediately over to Bob, because I think the material that he's been developing around George Washington starts to take one giant step in the direction of filling that gap in people's understanding. So there we go. All right, Bob.
Oh, okay. Well, hi, folks. As part of this series that Susan mentioned, I've done 2 classes so far on George Washington in the last period of time, and this will be the 3rd class. There are probably some people in this meeting here who did not see both or maybe didn't see either of the previous classes. But I am, there's no way I can go back over that material tonight. Um, and I just will repeat here that the thesis of this class series is that the American Revolution lasted 21 years, from 1775 to 1796. And that from the very beginning and throughout those 21 years, the intention was to establish a constitutional republic in the United States, um, uh, not only for the immediate goals that were desired, but for establishing a republic which would continue to exist and to serve the interests of our posterity, that it would be future oriented, and that Washington was the key leader from the beginning of that revolution up until 1796 of everything that occurred. There were many other people, but Washington was the leader of all of this. Now, what I'm going to go into tonight, I'm going to say a little bit more as just sort of a continuation from last week, a little bit more about Washington as an agricultural scientist and as a sponsor of industry, of technology, and of new inventions. And then I'm going to go into the convention itself and deal with the issue of slavery and the question of the broad powers of the republic to act on behalf of the general welfare. So, as some people might recall from last week, I talked about the fact that Washington had moved out of tobacco farming and become primarily, not entirely, but primarily a wheat farmer. And I don't think I gave the extraordinary scope of what Washington established. It's not like he just switched crops. Last week I went into some of that really what he created in Mount Vernon was an agro-industrial enterprise with the most advanced agricultural technology and methods anywhere in the United States, and really, anywhere in the United States. And one thing I do want to mention is that he not only became the largest and premier wheat farmer in the United States, but he was also the premier producer of flour. He built the most advanced grist mill in America, and he began marketing his own flour. He began marketing this all over the United States, in all of the states and all of the territories. There were barrels of flour, there were sacks of flour, and they were all labeled G. Washington. This was the G. Washington brand of flour, and it became the most trusted flour in America because of its quality. He became the first exporter of flour from the United States. His flour became famous. It was sold throughout the West Indies and Caribbean. It was shipped to the British Isles, and again became very famous because of the high quality of it. And again, this was very highly technologically advanced. He built in his flour milling operation, he built a system which was almost entirely automated. even without electricity. The way one historian described it, he says that in the production of his flour, Washington's, and I'm quoting here, Washington's product was not touched by human hands. From the time that the raw grain, the wheat, was dumped into the hopper until the finished flour flowed into the bin ready for packing into barrels or bags, it was not touched by human hand. It was entirely automated, very highly technologically advanced. And to give you some sense of it, at the peak of his production of flour, Washington was producing 275,000 pounds of flour per year, 275,000 pounds. And again, this was marketed everywhere. And it was the most sought after flour, throughout the United States. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about steamships and railroads, which people do not normally associate with George Washington. But in fact, Washington, one thing I will mention on this question of Washington's, advanced production of wheat and his advanced production of flour, this was all done before the Revolutionary War. And in fact, throughout the 13 colonies at that time, except for people involved in political life or, people involved in high-end agriculture or what have you, among the general public, Washington was extremely well known before the Revolutionary War because of his farming, because of his flour, because of his wheat production. Everybody in the colonies knew of Washington's flour and Washington's wheat. But to get back to steamships and railroads, things not generally associated with Washington. Now, in terms of steamships, a lot of Americans were taught in school or somehow assume that Robert Fulton was the inventor of the steamship, which is not even close to being the truth. He was a Johnny-come-lately. I'm not saying he was a bad guy, but he certainly did not invent the steamship or steamboat. Now, some people who know a little bit more about these matters think that a man named John Fitch invented the steamboat. Fitch was the one who brought his steamboat, newly invented steamboat, to Philadelphia during the Constitutional Convention, and all of the delegates went out to the riverbank and watched Fitch, sail his boat up and down the Delaware River during the Constitutional Convention. But Fitch was not the first inventor of a steamboat either. The first person in America to invent an operational steamboat was a man named James Rumsey. And Rumsey was a close associate and I wouldn't say protege, but close associate of Washington. And Washington sponsored his work on the steamboat for quite a number of years. I mean, directly sponsored it and helped Rumsey raise money to build and develop and modernize his steamboat. I mean, he was Rumsey's primary sponsor. He also, I mentioned, last week, I think it was, I talked about the Potomac Company, where they wanted to make the Potomac River, Washington and his allies wanted to make the Potomac River navigable way up the river, and then build canals out to the Ohio River and the Ohio Territory. Now, they never built the canals, but they did make they did dredging, rock removal. They built 5 different canals to get around waterfalls and rapids, and they made the Potomac River, which Washington was the president of, or the Potomac Company he was the president of. They made the Potomac River navigable, much further up the river than it was when they started. And Washington hired James Rumsey, the steamboat builder. He hired James Rumsey as the chief engineer of the Potomac Company. And they built these canals, and they did this dredging and rock removal. And then Rumsey would take his steamboat out on the Potomac and do test runs and trial runs on the very areas which they had just made navigable. Now, to give you some sense of this, or a little history of it, not too much. As far as I can tell, it might have been earlier, but as far as I can tell, Washington first met Rumsey in September of 1784 when he traveled up to the town where Rumsey lived. It was then in Virginia. It's now in West Virginia because they split away during the Civil War. And Rumsey showed Washington a working model of a mechanical boat he had designed. Now, this was not really a steamboat, but it had everything that was needed for a steamboat except the steam engine, and it did function even without the steam engine. They were able to go up against the current, to advance against the current. And Rumsey and Washington spent some time there with Rumsey discussing it and all of that, and he decided to sponsor it. And he wrote a certificate of endorsement and gave it to Rumsey for Rumsey to use to raise money for his, experimentation and for his building of the steamboat. And I'll read you a little excerpt from the certificate of endorsement that Washington wrote. And this was for prospective investors. And Washington wrote, "I have seen the model of Mr. Rumsey's boat constructed to work against the stream. I have examined the powers upon which it acts, been the eyewitness to the actual experiment in running water of some rapidity, and give it as my opinion, although I had but little faith before, that he has discovered the art of working boats by mechanism and small manual assistance against the rapid currents, and that this discovery is of vast importance, which may be of the greatest usefulness in our inland navigation, and if it succeeds, of which I have no doubt, that the value of it is greatly enhanced by the simplicity of the works, which, seen and explained, may be executed by the most common mechanic." So Washington wrote that endorsement of Rumsey's work and his boat in 1784. So this is, a year after the Treaty of Paris, ending the Revolutionary War. And then Rumsey, worked intensively on introducing the use of steam to power this boat. And in 1785, 2 years before Fitch's demonstration on the Delaware River, in 1785, he developed his first boat based on steam propulsion. And in this boat, a pump driven by steam power ejected a stream of water from the stern, thereby propelling the boat forward. Now, actually, Rumsey's design, which he built, was based on an earlier theoretical design by Daniel Bernoulli. And Benjamin Franklin, about the same time in 1786, also began proposing propelling a boat by steam-propelled water jet. And Franklin then became also a supporter and a contributor to Rumsey's development of a steam-powered boat. And Rumsey developed a boat based on, what everyone says is fluid power engineering, jet propulsion, fluid power engineering, which I'm not an engineer and I don't really know what that means, but I think you can get the gist of it. And this was built. And actually, Susan, why don't you we're going to do the first two slides. Put up the first slide if you can. That's a model of the boat that Rumsey built. There are a number of models, and they're all not, because he kept changing it and improving it. But that's a model of what Rumsey built. Now the second slide. And these are some modern day people. I think they belong to something called the Rumsey Society. And you can see they're all dressed up there, looking fine. And they built an actual replica of Rumsey's first steamboat. And here they are, on the river somewhere. I don't know which river this is, but this is actually an authentic replica of the boat that Rumsey built in 1785. All right, you can take that down. We'll get to the third slide in a bit. So this was all directly financed, sponsored by Washington, who worked very closely with Rumsey during this entire period when Rumsey was the engineering chief of the Potomac Company. And Washington worked with him not only on, developing the Potomac River, but on his steamboat. An entirely new invention, which Washington was enthusiastically backing. Now, I want to mention someone else who didn't have quite a close relationship with Washington, but he was associated with Washington. And the most important work he did was after Washington died. But nevertheless, it gives you an indication that, when you say Washington was a rice farmer, people say, okay, yeah, he was a rice farmer, not rice, wheat. He was a wheat farmer. Sorry, he was a wheat farmer, but he and he had advanced, agricultural techniques, but he was still a farmer. Well, with Rumsey and with the next guy I'm going to mention, you could see he was more than just a farmer, even if it was an advanced scientific farmer. He was much more than that. So I want to mention a man named Colonel John Stevens, who was an engineer, a scientist, an inventor, who constructed the first ever steam locomotive in the United States. Now, Stevens enlisted in the Army, the regular Army, during the Revolutionary War when he was quite young, 1776. He was promoted to being a captain in Washington's army, and then later he was promoted to colonel. I'm not that familiar with his career in the army, but he did meet Washington and get to know Washington. He was a colonel, which is, just one step below general. And he got to know Washington during the Revolutionary War, and they maintained a correspondence long after the war. So they were associated with one another. I have no record of Washington directly sponsoring Stevens' experiments and what he built, but they were closely associated. As I said, the most important work that Stevens did was after Washington's death. But in 1806, Stevens built a steamship called the Phoenix, which became the first steamship to navigate on the open ocean. Prior to that, Fitch, Rumsey, and these guys, they were building riverboats, on the Delaware, on the Potomac. But Stevens actually built a steamship that operated on the open ocean. And he took one of them as part of a, demonstration of what it was capable of. He took one of them on a journey, whatever it's called, on open water, from Hoboken, which is where he was based, next to New York City, from Hoboken to Philadelphia, sailing on the open ocean. That was in 1806. Then in 1812, Stevens wrote a pamphlet arguing for the development of steam locomotives, railroads. Now, this is before any steam locomotive had been built. or any railroad had been built, 1812. But he wrote a pamphlet titled Documents Tending to Prove the Superior Advantage of Railways and Steam Carriages over Canal Navigation, advocating rail travel. And in 1815, he obtained a charter, I believe, from the state of New Jersey, to build the first railroad in the United States. And he built a railroad. He never put it into commercial operation, but he sort of built it, and he never built a railroad system, but he invented a steam locomotive, and he built track to demonstrate as a proof of principle that this could be built, right? And you could put up the third one now. There it is. This is on Stevens' property in Hoboken, and he built a circular track, with his little railroad, steam-powered locomotive. That actually is a locomotive, and people came from miles around, to ride on this railroad, to watch it and ride on it. I guess he could attach some thing to it, and a few people could ride it, or maybe they would just get on that contraption and they would ride it. And he proved that this could be built, that rail traffic was possible, and he argued that it was far superior to inland naval traffic. And this was around 1815, or slightly thereafter, 1816, when he built this. For those people who have heard of the Stevens Institute of Technology, which for a long time was one of the leading scientific institutes of higher learning in the United States, it's named after this individual. It's named after John Stevens, who, again, like Rumsey, was closely associated with George Washington. So you don't normally think of Washington, in terms of railroads or steamships, but really that is who he was, and it was that, technological advancement, and technological innovation, technological discovery, which he was very much committed to, as the future of America. And when you think about Hamilton's report on manufacturers, where he talks about scientific advancement, new inventions, new technologies, cutting edge manufacturing, and making this, the center of the new republic. Well, this is what Washington was committed to long before Hamilton wrote the report on manufacturers. This is his concept of what a republic needs to be based on. And, so I will also just mention one other little anecdote. I'm not going to get into it, but also at some point, I don't know if it was when he was president or after he left the White House, I'm not positive, but at some point, Washington saw a demonstration of a hot air balloon. And like Franklin, who had witnessed the hot air balloons in Paris, when he was in Paris, Washington became extremely enthusiastic about the potential for hot air balloons and flight. So that's Washington. And he was as much committed to this kind of scientific and technological progress as Benjamin Franklin was. So I just wanted to mention that little bit about, these inventions and discoveries and what have you. So I'm going to now just go back into two facets of the Constitutional Convention, one of which I didn't really get a chance to go into at all last week, which is this question of slavery. Because as I said last week, slavery was not something that was swept under the rug at the convention. or that everyone, agreed to to tolerate it, agreed to it. That's just not true at all. As I said last week, it was one of the 2 or 3 or 4 biggest battles at the convention. It began at the very beginning of the convention, and it went all the way through the convention to the final days. It was a huge battle. And, it's worth mentioning that, among the delegates to the convention, were a number of people who were abolitionists or who were strongly anti-slavery. Now, these included, but it's not limited to them, these included Benjamin Franklin, who at that time of the convention was the president of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery. It included Alexander Hamilton and Gouverneur Morris, who were both founding members of the New York Manumission Society, with its ultimate aim to end slavery. It included Rufus King, who was also a member of the New York Manumission Society, and Rufus King had authored the Northwest Ordinance, outlawing the existence of slavery in the Northwest Territories, what's now Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, etc. Rufus King had authored the Anti-Slavery Clause of the Northwest Ordinance. It included Governor William Livingston, who was the governor of New Jersey, John Jay's father-in-law, who had who was a member of the he also was a member of the New York Manumission Society, and 1 year before the Constitutional Convention, he had pushed through the New Jersey legislature a law banning the slave trade, the buying and selling of slaves, not just the importation of slaves, but the buying and selling of slaves by anyone in the state of New Jersey. And really, it includes George Washington. People, you have a lot of people who denounce Washington as a slave owner, and then others who are, wishy-washy on the issue. They say, well, they try to make excuses for Washington. But really, by 1783, by the end of the Revolutionary War, and certainly by the time of the Constitutional Convention, Washington was very much anti-slavery, and he was really a quasi-abolitionist. As you may remember, last week I quoted from Washington in a letter he wrote to Robert Morris, I think only a couple of weeks before the convention was held, the Philadelphia Convention. He wrote to Robert Morris saying, "There is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of slavery." Right? Endorsing the abolition of slavery. He also wrote numerous other letters, anti-slavery letters. The most it's not really famous, but the most well-known of which is the letter he wrote to Lafayette when Lafayette purchased a plantation in the Caribbean, one of the French islands in the Caribbean. He purchased a slave plantation, and immediately after buying the plantation, Lafayette freed all the slaves, and then who were working there, who he owned, because he owned the plantation. He freed them all immediately. And then for those who wanted to come back and work for him, he hired them back and paid them wages. When Washington learned of this, he wrote a letter to Lafayette praising Lafayette to the skies, and saying that he hoped, with great hope, that this would become the model for the plantation owners in the South in the United States, and that this would become the model for freeing all the slaves in America. There's also, as people know, he freed his slaves in his will, but not only that, he stopped the practice of buying and selling slaves while he was still alive, because everyone who owned slaves, maybe if you owned one slave or two slaves, you didn't do it, But all these plantation owners who owned a large number of slaves, they all bought and sold slaves, to each other and what have you. They all bought and sold slaves. But see, on Washington's plantation, he only owned about a quarter or a third of the slaves. I don't know the exact percentage. He owned a minority of the slaves. And the majority of the slaves were owned by Martha Washington, who had inherited them and held them in some kind of legal trust. Washington didn't own them. Martha Washington owned them. But if Washington, the slaves all lived in the same quarters, and they all lived together and worked together. It wasn't that they were separate. And a lot of Martha's slaves and Washington's slaves intermarried and had children. And if Washington had sold any of his slaves, it would have, broken up a lot of these families. He could have sold one of his slaves to another plantation or somewhere. And, but meanwhile, the person married to that slave and the children of that slave might have been owned by Martha. And Washington, before the Revolutionary War, ended the buying and selling of slaves, because he said he could not, in all good conscience, separate families. He could not separate fathers from their children, fathers from their wives, and he wouldn't do it. And it's also the case that at Mount Vernon, as Washington developed this into a highly advanced agricultural and industrial enterprise, it wasn't just slaves. Washington had many free laborers at Mount Vernon, many, white and black. And also what he did was the slaves that were working, in the rice production, he had a blacksmith's operation, he had a textile and weaving operation, he had a fishery that he developed. And the Washington began, you think of, Gone with the Wind, or when they sing slaves out picking cotton. Washington began to develop many of his slaves as skilled laborers. A large percentage of his slaves worked in the blacksmiths' shops, and they became highly skilled blacksmiths and metal workers. Washington was anti-slavery. As I said, he was really practically an abolitionist at the time of the Constitutional Convention. And so you had these people: Gouverneur Morris, Alexander Hamilton, Rufus King, William Livingston, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, were all at the Constitutional Convention. They all hated slavery. So this became a big fight. Now, they knew that they could not abolish slavery at the convention, but they were determined to hem it in, to sabotage it, to sort of corner it, under severe restrictions, with the idea that as time went on, they could get rid of it. One of the reasons they knew they couldn't get rid of it is because they were outnumbered. At the convention, the northern states were underrepresented for the entirety of the convention. Bear in mind that Vermont didn't attend because they weren't yet a state. Rhode Island refused to attend the convention and never went there. New York, once they sent 3 delegates, but after 2 of them withdrew because they didn't want to, they were committed to the Articles of Confederation, and only Hamilton was left. New York lost its vote at the convention because they were voting by states. So for most of the convention, New York wasn't there, New Hampshire, Rhode Island wasn't there, Vermont wasn't there, and also New Hampshire was there for less than half the time, because the New Hampshire delegation kept going back to New Hampshire for extended periods, and then they would come back, and then they would leave again. So for most of the convention, there were no delegates there was no representation from New York, New Hampshire, Vermont, Rhode Island, and the southern slave states were in the majority in terms of voting strength at the convention for almost the entirety of the convention. And then to make matters worse, um, South Carolina and Georgia let it be known fairly early in the convention that if any, strong moves were made against slavery at the convention, that that they would walk out and that they would refuse to adopt the Constitution. So they were exercising blackmail. Now, this was not the first time that they had tried to that they did this. You could go back to the question of the Declaration of Independence. As some people might know, the original Declaration of Independence, the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, contained a strong anti-slavery clause, condemning slavery very strongly and the slave trade. And in 1776, when that first draft was submitted to, I have the clause here. I was going to read it, but I'm not going to read it because I'm already running late. But it was very strong anti-slavery clause in the first, draft of the Declaration of Independence. And at that time, the delegates, the representatives, they were representatives from Georgia and South Carolina in the Continental Congress in 1776, demanded that the clause be removed. And they said, if you do not remove this clause, we as the delegates, or as the representatives of Georgia and South Carolina, will refuse to sign the Declaration of Independence, which if they had done that in 1776, this could have had fatal consequences in the Revolutionary War. So the clause was removed, and this was blackmail. And they did the exact same thing 11 years later at the Constitutional Convention. Now, in addition to that, there was a lot of skullduggery, if that's right, a lot of secretive stuff that went on. Towards the end of the convention, the last month, 3 to 4 weeks of the convention lasted 4 weeks or 4 months. And, by the time you get into the beginning of the 4th month, these guys want to get out of town. They are tired. They are worn out because they're meeting like 10 hours a day, or at one point they went up to 12 hours a day, because, they were behind. They couldn't get anything done. They didn't maintain that, but, they were just worn out. There were so many things they couldn't resolve, so many things they couldn't agree upon. So what they did in the last few weeks of the convention was they set up a series of committees, smaller committees. And these committees were basically given the authority to solve all of the unsolved problems, And one of the committees that was set up was called the Committee on the Committee on Detail, And this was headed up by a man named John Rutledge of South Carolina. And what Rutledge did is he rewrote or wrote, put into the Constitution all of the things that had not been agreed upon on the issue of slavery. They wrote new clauses where they basically said, for instance, they wrote a clause in there extending the slave trade for 20 years. They introduced a fugitive slave clause, which had not even been discussed prior to this. And they authored new clauses on slavery, all of which, strengthened what South Carolina and Georgia wanted. And these were then introduced into the final Constitution. Because when this occurred, when these several committees wrote these new clauses and basically settled all of these areas where there had been disagreements, most of those clauses automatically went into the Constitution, because they didn't want the body of the convention didn't want to revisit these things again. They had been fighting about them for 3 months or longer, and they said whatever these committees agree upon, we're more or less going to go with, and that didn't happen all the time, but it happened most of the time. So this committee on detail under Rutledge greatly strengthened, or greatly enhanced, what South Carolina and Georgia wanted in regard to slavery. But this was a huge fight. And the person who was the primary, enemy of, South Carolina and Georgia and the slave power at the convention, he wasn't the only one, but the primary one was Gouverneur Morris. Now, despite the fact that I'm getting behind, I do want to read you. I've done this before, but I want to do it here. Morris's speech to the delegates on August 8th. And this is over the question of the 3/5 clause, to give the slave states more power in Congress and the Electoral College by allowing them to count some of their slaves towards their representation. And Morris fought the 3/5 clause from the first day of the convention to the last day of the convention. He never compromised on it. He did not vote for it. He was against it. He gave a speech on August 8th, and I want to read you part of what he said. He said, "Upon what principle is it that the slaves shall be computed in the representation? Are they men? Then make them citizens and let them vote. Are they property? Why then is no other property included? The houses in Philadelphia are worth more than all the wretched slaves that cover the rice swamps of South Carolina. The admission of slaves into the representation, when fairly explained, comes to this, that the inhabitant of Georgia and South Carolina, who goes to the coast of Africa and in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity, tears away his fellow creatures from their dearest connections and damns them to the most cruel bondages, shall have more votes in a government instituted in the protection of the rights of mankind than the citizen of Philadelphia or New Jersey, who views with laudable horror so nefarious a practice. Domestic slavery is the most prominent feature in the aristocratic countenance of the proposed Constitution. The vassalage of the poor has ever been the favorite offspring of aristocracy. And what is the proposed compensation to the northern states for a sacrifice of every principle of right, of every impulse of humanity? They are to bind themselves to march their militias for the defense of the southern states, for the defense against those very slaves of whom they complained. Slavery is a nefarious institution, the curse of heaven on the states where it prevails. Compare the free regions of the Middle States, where a rich and noble cultivation marks the prosperity and the happiness of the people, with the misery and poverty which overspread the barren wastes of Virginia and the other states having slaves. Travel through the whole continent, and you behold the prospect continually varying with the appearance and disappearance of slavery. Passing through the Jerseys and entering Pennsylvania, every criteria of superior improvement witnesses the change in prosperity. Then proceed southwardly, and every step you take through the great region of slaves presents a desert, increasing with the increasing proportion of these wretched beings. So that's part of Gouverneur Morris's speech. And bear in mind, he's on the floor of the convention. speaking to all the delegates who were in attendance, among whom are some of the largest slave owners in Georgia, South Carolina, Virginia, and elsewhere. They're sitting right in front of him. And he's standing there on the floor of the convention saying domestic slavery, or saying slavery is a nefarious institution, right? So, this is a guy who knew no fear, to believe me. A short quote from another speech by William Livingston, who was not only the father-in-law of John Jay, but the sponsor of the young Alexander Hamilton. When Hamilton first came up from, the Caribbean and, went to school in New Jersey, he lived at the home of William Livingston and was, sponsored by William Livingston in his education. And later, with Livingston's and some other people's backing, he got into Columbia University. So, Livingston is a, very important guy. And I'll just give you one sentence from a speech he gave at the convention, where he says, slavery is utterly inconsistent with the principles of Christianity and humanity. And in Americans who have almost idealized liberty, it is a peculiarly odious and disgraceful institution. So that's Livingston. So these are some of the speeches being given on the floor of the convention. And the 3/5 clause was battled for months on the convention. Introduced, passed, reintroduced, rejected, introduced again, changed, accepted, rejected. It was a huge fight. And slavery itself was a key moral battleground at the convention. So, I just thought I would, anyway, that's the end of the discussion on slavery, because, we have to get into this question of the creation of this republic, with broad powers to act on behalf of the general welfare. I introduced this last week, but I want to say a little bit more about it today. And I want to look at 5 clauses that are in the final version of the Constitution, the version that was approved in Philadelphia and ratified by all 13 states after the, later. And I want to look at 5 clauses. And I'm going to read you the clauses and say just a little bit about them, not in depth, but a little bit. These are sometimes called the elastic clauses, or there's other names for them. The clauses that contain what are today called the implied powers, among other things. The first clause is the Supremacy Clause, which is Article 6, Clause 2. And I'm going to read you the clauses because they're not very long. The Supremacy Clause says, this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made, under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state of the contrary notwithstanding. This means that the United States is a unified republic, and that the Constitution of the United States and the laws of the United States as passed in Congress, which are coherent with that Constitution, are the supreme law of the entire nation over every state in the nation. This is the Supremacy Clause. Then there is the Necessary and Proper Clause, Article 1, Section 8, which says, Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by the Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. So all laws necessary and proper uh, 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 that the Congress has the authority to enact laws that are necessary and proper to carry out the supreme authority of the government on behalf of the commitment of the government as laid out really in the preamble and on behalf of the general welfare of the people. And in Federalist Number 33, Washington strongly defends both the Supremacy Clause and the Necessary and Proper Clause. Then there are the three vesting clauses, which I'll read. All legislative powers herein, number one, all legislative powers herein shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives. Number two, the executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America. Number three, the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. So, this, unlike the Virginia plan, which had a toothless judiciary and a ceremonial president, this establishes, through what are called the vesting powers, where the Congress, the judiciary, and the executive, the presidency, are all vested with independent, supreme authority within their own particular realms. Then there's the Commerce Clause, which says the Congress shall have power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states with the Indian tribes. Now, this may not seem like this has implied powers, but beginning with John Marshall and the Marshall Court, the Commerce Clause has been broadly interpreted. Again, a lot of this is based in the general welfare, and such that giving the federal government power over interstate and foreign transport has been interpreted broadly, that power can be used in the furtherance of promoting and protecting the general welfare of the people. For instance, as one example, and this is all I'm going to really say about it, in recent decades, the commerce power has been used, the Commerce Clause has been used in court and upheld over such things as federal drug prohibition laws, that since drugs are transported across state lines, that under the Commerce Clause, the federal government has broad power to take anti-drug and drug trafficking and other anti-drug initiatives against the drug trade. So this has been given broad interpretation. Finally, the General Welfare Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, which says, the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises to pay the debts of the United States and to provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. Now, this has been a bone of contention for decades, maybe for more than 100 years or longer. Or actually, it really goes back to Madison and Jefferson's objection to the national bank. So it really goes back to the Washington administration, where they say, no, this doesn't really mean that. It doesn't mean that Congress shall have power to provide for the common defense and general welfare, even though that's stated, in in the preamble that the government will, has the power and the mandate to promote and provide and promote for the general welfare of the people. Madison and Jefferson later argued fiercely that this power doesn't exist, and when Hamilton issued his opinion in defense of the constitutionality of the national bank, and for when Hamilton argued for the policies he was promoting in the report on manufacturers, he bases it, directly on this clause, the general welfare clause. And all of this, everything I read to you, these are called enabling clauses, elastic clauses, all these various things, the Commerce Clause, the General Welfare Clause, the Necessary and Proper Clause, all of this. This all is subsumed within the mandate in the preamble written by Gouverneur Morris, that we, the people of the United States, to form a more perfect union, to establish justice, to ensure domestic tranquility, I'll skip some, promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution. So all of this is subsumed within the preamble, written by Morris, which came out of the Committee on Style, and which announces the intention of the Constitution. For what purpose are you establishing this government, this republic, creating this republic? And the purpose is enunciated in the preamble, and all of these clauses, including the Necessary and Proper Clause and the General Welfare Clause, are built upon the intention which is announced in the preamble. Now, I could tell you, for those who are fans of Madison, and Jefferson, they deny the government has this power, and they denounce fiercely Gouverneur Morris, fiercely. One of the things they point to is this Federalist paper written by Madison, Federalist Number 41, and everybody talks about this. All these people, who really, say limited government, they all deny that the government has these powers. And one of the things they point to is a Federalist paper, number 41, written by Madison, where Madison directly, explicitly denies the authority of the federal government to act on behalf of the American citizenry. He defines in Federalist 41 that the General Welfare Clause, which I read to you, is limited entirely to the enumerated powers within the Constitution, the enumerated powers of the government within the Constitution, that the General Welfare Clause extends only to those enumerated powers. That's in Federalist 41. And, this legal scholars, study, they talk about this Federalist 41 all the time. But what none of them talk about is that Federalist 41, which, they say, this proves it. This proves that, we're only limited to enumerated powers. Federalist 41 is only Madison's opinion. It's a mere opinion. It's not part of the Constitution. It's not in the Constitution. It is simply an opinion of James Madison. And the fact is, George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and Gouverneur Morris and Rufus King and quite a few other people did not agree with Madison's opinion. So, when you read Madison's Federalist 41, you're not talking about someone who is defining the nature of the Constitution. You're talking about an opinion in Federalist 41, which none of these other guys agreed with. And it's very clear that, look, what occurred, as I said last week, the Virginia plan was put forward. It had it was a very bad document, very weak. And what occurred through the course of the Constitution is that the nationalist outlook of Washington, Hamilton, Morris, and others, the nationalist outlook that they had, by the end of the Constitution, it had really won out. They had not gotten everything they wanted. Everyone made compromises at the convention, but the nationalist outlook of a sovereign republic with a strong executive, a strong judiciary, and a government, a federal government, mandated, not just committed, but mandated by the preamble to use its sovereign authority to act on behalf of the people and the posterity, to act for the future, because that's what it means to act for posterity, to act for the future. And the government with the broad powers to do whatever is necessary and proper to act for that future. This all was in the final Constitution. Not what Madison proposed at the beginning of the convention. And I will also, anyway, I want to end with one thing, because what you're seeing today, you could see it in the American Revolution. What you see it in the Declaration of Independence, and you absolutely see it in the creation of the Constitution and the Republic. What you're seeing is the creation of something new. In 1775, the population was being destroyed in the colonies, literally being destroyed. And it was very clear under the Townshend Acts and all of these other acts and the tariffs, the forbidding of manufacturing, that, the freedom and the economic progress that had existed earlier in the colonies was being snuffed out. That the government in Great Britain, the Parliament, the monarchy, were determined to grind the American colonists into the dirt, literally. And it was a life and death crisis. And what it demanded was the creation of something new. So I want to read to you, and I can't tell you where, I'll tell you what it is, but I have no idea if or where you could find this today. But in some years ago, and I don't even have the date, Lyndon LaRouche wrote a short memo to our membership. It was not a public writing. It was a short memo for our membership, dealing with problems he saw within our membership, within our organization, that people, that we were going into a deeper crisis in the country. And basically what he was saying, as politely as he could, is that the members of our movement were not prepared for the crisis and were not up to snuff to do what had to be done. And, what he talked about is, that what is required is continually creating a new approach, creating something new. And I'll just read to you a few sentences from what he said, okay? People try to be practical. They prove that in doing so, they prove that they are essentially stupid. And that's what the problem is. People say, let's be practical. I say, they're all they're all ready to sink right now. Practical people are stupid people. That's the general rule. If you look at what is if you are looking at what is possible presently, you are a fool unless you are able to create and bring the future, a new future, into play. And that is the basis for the actual principles of strategy. You have to do the impossible. If you don't do the impossible, you're going to lose. That's the only way you're going to win, to do the impossible. And if you think back to what was done, including at the Constitutional Convention, they did the impossible. They went in there with the slave owners, with the people who wanted independent states, with a country that was falling apart, a country that was in chaos, bankrupt, no money, no this, no that, and they went in there and they created, really, they did the impossible. They created something entirely new. They created a republic that had never been seen before. And they created around principles of acting on behalf of the future. And if you look at Hamilton in his report on manufacturing, if you look at Washington, with his scientific agriculture, his sponsorship of steamboats, if you look at Franklin, the genius, the scientific genius, they're creating it. This is what their republic is going to be. This is the type of nation they're determined to create. And, the seemingly impossible thing is they created it. And really today, we're not going to have a new constitutional convention. We're not going to create a new republic. But, in the political work we're involved in today, I would just ask you to continually remind yourself of what Lynn says. Practical people are stupid people, and they always fail. That we have to be, committed to creating the impossible today, which means you can't be practical. And Lynn went on to say in this little memo that I was reading you, but I'm not going to quote this, you constantly have to be thinking about creating something new, doing something new, accomplishing the impossible. And that's what they did at the Constitutional Convention. So this has been quite long. I thought it was going to be shorter. So let's stop and open it up.